Texas, 1943. The train slowed to a grinding halt, metal screaming against metal, and through the gaps in the cattle car slats, Werner Muller caught his first glimpse of America. Not the America he'd been told about. The propaganda had promised ruins and chaos, a nation of mongrels tearing itself apart. Instead, he saw endless sky, the kind of horizon that swallowed fear whole. Heat shimmered off the rails like liquid glass, distorting the distant outline of guard towers and barracks. Beside him, 40 other German prisoners pressed against the walls, squinting into the blinding Texas sun. None of them realized it yet, but in the coming months, this place would defeat what years of Allied bombs could not, the certainty that they were fighting for something true. The door slid open with a metallic shriek. "Raus! Schnell!" The command came sharp and clear, but the accent was wrong. Werner's head snapped toward the voice. An American guard stood there, rifle slung over his shoulder, speaking perfect German. Not textbook German. Not the stilted phrases of a classroom learner. The man spoke with the rolling rhythm of the Rhineland, the kind of German Werner's grandmother used when she told stories by the fire. The guard's face was sunburned, his uniform dust-covered, but his words carried the weight of someone who'd learned the language at his mother's knee. "Willkommen in Texas," the guard continued, gesturing toward the platform. "You'll be processed here, given quarters, and assigned work details. No tricks, no trouble, and you'll be treated fairly." Werner exchanged glances with Ernst, a young soldier from Hamburg who'd been captured in Tunisia. Ernst's mouth hung open. Around them, whispers spread through the car like wind through wheat. "He speaks German. How does he speak German? Are we still in Europe?" The prisoners filed out slowly, boots hitting packed earth, eyes adjusting to the brutal afternoon light. The camp sprawled before them, neat rows of wooden barracks. A mess hall with smoke rising from its chimney, guard towers spaced evenly along chain-link fences. But what caught Werner's attention wasn't the architecture. It was the guards. 3 of them stood near the processing station, and all 3 were speaking German to each other, laughing about something casual as old friends at a beer hall. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with steel-gray hair, noticed Werner staring. "Sie sprechen Deutsch?" Werner asked, the words barely above a whisper. The guard smiled. "My whole life. My parents came from Bremen in 1912, raised us speaking both languages." He extended a hand. "Sergeant Frank Schmidt. Your English will improve here, but for now, we'll make do." Werner shook the offered hand, feeling something inside him shift. This wasn't the script. The regime's narrative had been clear Americans were cultural barbarians, a melting pot that had melted away anything worth preserving. Yet here stood a man who spoke German like Werner's own father, who carried both identities with obvious pride. From the processing station, another voice called out in German, "Form lines by height. We need accurate measurements for work assignments." The voice belonged to a younger guard, perhaps 25, with the angular features of someone from Saxony. His German carried the precise enunciation of the eastern regions, the kind that made every syllable land with purpose. Ernst leaned close to Werner. This has to be a trick, some kind of psychological operation. But as the afternoon wore on, the theory fell apart. The German-speaking guards weren't interrogators. They were simply men doing their jobs, men who happened to speak the language because their families had brought it across the Atlantic generations ago. They joked with prisoners who understood, switched seamlessly to English when speaking to other guards, and showed no sign that their bilingualism was anything remarkable. By evening, the prisoners had been assigned to barracks and given their first American meal. Werner sat on a wooden bench in the mess hall, staring at the food before him: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and something the cook called cornbread. Beside him, a young guard named Thomas Becker, another German-American, explained the dishes in German. "The cornbread's a southern thing," Thomas said, his accent carrying hints of Bavaria. "My grandmother never made it, but down here, they serve it with everything. Try it with butter." Werner broke off a piece, still warm, and watched the butter melt into the golden surface. The taste was unfamiliar, but not unpleasant. Across the table, Ernst was eating methodically, his face a mask of confusion. "In Hamburg," Ernst said quietly, "we were eating sawdust bread by the time I left. Sawdust and potato peels. Thomas nodded, his expression sobering. The war's been hard on everyone. But here, we've got enough. You'll see. That night, Werner lay on his bunk and listened to the camp settling into darkness. Outside, cicadas sang their relentless song, a sound he'd never heard in Germany. The air was thick and hot, even with the windows open, and the unfamiliar humidity made his uniform cling to his skin. Around him, other prisoners whispered in the dark, trying to make sense of the day. "Did you hear the one they call Schmidt?" someone asked. "He told me his grandfather fought for Prussia in 1870. His family's been German for 1,000 years, but here they are, American as anyone else." "It doesn't make sense," another voice replied. "How can they be both? How can they fight against their own blood?" Werner didn't answer, but the question haunted him. He'd been raised on the idea that blood and soil were inseparable, that identity was fixed and eternal. Yet these guards seemed to carry multiple identities without contradiction, speaking German in the morning and English in the afternoon, loyal to America while honoring their German heritage. The next morning brought Werner's first work assignment. He was placed on a farm detail, sent with 20 other prisoners to help with the cotton harvest on a ranch 30 miles from the camp. The foreman, a weathered man named Karl Hoffmann, greeted them in German so fluent it could have come from any village along the Rhine. "I grew up speaking German at home and English everywhere else," Karl explained as they rode in the back of a truck toward the fields. "My parents wanted us to remember where we came from, but they also wanted us to be American. It was never one or the other." The cotton fields stretched to the horizon, white bolls bursting from their pods under the merciless sun. Werner had never seen cotton growing before, had never imagined that so much of his world, the shirts he wore, the bandages in field hospitals, came from plants like these. The work was brutal. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, and the dry dust coated his throat until every breath felt like sandpaper. But Karl worked beside them, showing them how to pick without damaging the bowls, sharing water from his canteen, speaking German when the prisoners struggled to understand his English instructions. By midday, Werner's hands were raw and his back screamed, but something else was happening. The rage that had sustained him through capture, through the humiliation of defeat, was beginning to dissolve. During the lunch break, Karl sat with the prisoners in the shade of a massive oak tree. He unpacked sandwiches from a metal lunchbox, thick slices of bread, ham, cheese, pickles, and shared them freely. "My wife makes enough for an army," he said, grinning. "She's German, too. Her family came from the Black Forest. She still makes Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte every Christmas, just like her grandmother taught her." "How long have your people been here?" Werner asked, accepting a sandwich with cautious gratitude. "My grandparents arrived in 1885, settled in New Braunfels, a German town not far from here. Half the people there still speak German at home. We've got German churches, German schools, German newspapers. It's not like we gave up who we were. We just became American too." Ernst spoke up, his voice tight. "But you're fighting against Germany now. Your own people." Karl's expression darkened. "I'm fighting against a regime that's destroying everything German civilization stood for. My grandmother told me stories about the old country poets, philosophers, musicians, scientists. That's the Germany I honor. Not the one burning books and invading neighbors." The words hung in the hot air like smoke. Around the circle, prisoners shifted uncomfortably. Werner bit into the sandwich, tasting ham and sharp cheese, and felt the propaganda machinery in his mind begin to crack. That evening, back at the camp, Werner encountered Sergeant Schmidt again. The older man was making his evening rounds, checking that the barracks were secure for the night. He paused at Werner's bunk, noticing the younger man's troubled expression. "Hard day?" Schmidt asked in German, keeping his voice low. "I don't understand this place," Werner admitted. "I don't understand how you can be German and American at the same time." Schmidt sat on the edge of the bunk, his rifle resting across his knees. "My father used to say that being German taught him how to think, but being American taught him how to live. He came here with nothing, worked in a brewery in Milwaukee, raised 6 children. He never stopped being German. We spoke it at home. We went to German church. We ate German food. But he also loved this country, loved what it stood for. Freedom to build a life, freedom to be yourself. But the war broke his heart. Schmidt interrupted gently. When it started, when Germany invaded Poland, he cried for 3 days. He knew what it meant. Knew his sons would have to fight against the country of his birth. But he also knew we couldn't stand by while that regime consumed Europe. Werner felt tears threatening. I thought we were making Germany great again. I thought we were restoring honor. Honor isn't built on conquest, son. It's built on how you treat people when you have power over them. That's why you're being treated fairly here. That's why we speak to you in your own language, feed you properly, give you medical care. Because that's what honor actually means. The sergeant stood, adjusting his rifle strap. Get some rest. Tomorrow's another day. Werner lay awake long after Schmidt left, staring at the dark ceiling. Outside, the cicadas sang their endless song, and somewhere in the distance, a guard was whistling a tune that Werner recognized, an old German folk song his mother used to sing. The weeks blurred into months. Summer faded into fall, though the Texas heat barely noticed the change. Werner's work assignments varied, sometimes farm labor, sometimes maintenance around the camp, once a week-long detail helping to repair a bridge outside San Antonio. Everywhere he went, he encountered German Americans. They were mechanics and farmers, teachers and shopkeepers, guards and foremen. They spoke German with their families, English with their neighbors, and carried both identities with an ease that Werner was slowly beginning to understand. One afternoon in October, Werner was assigned to help with repairs at a ranch owned by the Wagner family. Hermann Wagner was a third-generation German-American, a man whose grandfather had fought for the Union in the Civil War, while his cousins fought for the Confederacy. Hermann spoke German with the rolling accent of the Palatinate, and his ranch house was decorated with both American flags and Black Forest carvings. My grandfather used to say America was an idea, not a bloodline, Hermann explained while they fixed a fence line. He said that's what made it different. In the old country, you were what you were born. Here, you could become something else. Hermann's teenage daughter, Lisa, brought them water in the afternoon. She was a striking girl, with her mother's blonde hair and her father's serious eyes. She spoke to Werner in German, her accent perfect, but her vocabulary peppered with English words. Father says you're from Heidelberg, she said, handing him a glass jar of cold water. I've always wanted to visit there. See the castle, walk by the river. It's beautiful, Werner said softly. Or it was, before the bombing. Lisa's expression grew somber. My cousin was killed in France. He was in the 45th Infantry Division. His grandmother, my great-aunt, came from Bavaria. She hasn't spoken to anyone since we got the telegram. The complexity of it struck Werner like a physical blow. This girl's family had been torn apart by a war between their two homelands. Her cousin had died fighting against people who might have been his relatives. The propaganda had never prepared him for this, for the reality that the world was more complicated than the simple narratives of us and them. That evening, back at the camp, Werner joined a group gathered in the recreation barracks. A new prisoner had arrived, a man named Friedrich who'd been captured in Italy. Friedrich was holding forth about the treatment of prisoners, his voice bitter and defiant. They're trying to break us, Friedrich insisted, making us comfortable, feeding us well, letting us work outside the camp. It's all designed to make us forget who we are. Werner felt something inside him harden. Or maybe they're just decent people treating us the way human beings should be treated. Friedrich turned on him. You've been here too long. You're starting to believe their lies. What lies? Werner stood, his voice rising. That German Americans exist? That people can be loyal to multiple identities? That the regime says propaganda was designed to make us hate anyone who wasn't exactly like us? The room went silent. Other prisoners watched, uncertain who to support. I've worked beside men who speak German as well as my own father, Werner continued. Men whose grandparents came from the same regions as mine. Men who love German culture, German music, German philosophy. And they're also proud Americans. They're not traitors. They're not confused. They're just people who understand something we were never taught, that identity isn't a cage. Friedrich's face flushed red. You're a collaborator. A traitor to the fatherland. The fatherland sent me to die in a desert for a madman's dream, Werner shot back. These people fed me, treated my wounds, and showed me more respect than my own officers ever did. So yes, I'm starting to question everything I was told. And maybe you should too. Later that night, Ernst found Werner sitting outside the barracks, staring at the stars. A younger man sat down beside him without speaking. They remained that way for a long time, listening to the night sounds of Texas crickets and distant cattle, the murmur of guards talking quietly at their posts. My father was a teacher, Ernst said finally. He taught literature. Goethe, Schiller, Heine. When the regime came to power, they told him which books he could teach and which he couldn't. He kept teaching the forbidden ones anyway, in secret. They arrested him in 1938. I haven't heard from him since. Werner turned to look at his friend. Ernst's face was shadowed, but his eyes reflected starlight. He used to say that German culture was bigger than any government, Ernst continued. That you couldn't destroy Beethoven or Bach by burning books. That the real Germany lived in the hearts of anyone who loved truth and beauty and knowledge. Ernst paused. I think he'd understand this place. I think he'd see that German culture survived here better than it did back home. Because here it was a choice, Werner said quietly. Not an obligation enforced by violence. Exactly. The months turned. Winter came, mild by German standards, but cold enough to require jackets. Werner's English improved, though he still preferred speaking German with the guards who could. He learned the names of Texas plants and animals, learned to distinguish the calls of different birds, learned to read the subtle shifts in weather that Texans took for granted. He also learned about the German-American communities scattered across Texas. Sergeant Schmidt brought him books from the camp library histories of German immigration, collections of German-American poetry, newspapers from places like Fredericksburg and New Braunfels, where German was still the primary language of business. Werner devoured these texts, trying to understand how his people had maintained their identity while building new lives in a foreign land. In February 1944, Werner was assigned to a special detail. A local school in New Braunfels needed help repairing damage from a winter storm, and German prisoners with carpentry skills were being sent to assist. Werner had worked in his father's workshop before the war, knew his way around wood and tools. The town was a revelation. German-style buildings lined the main street half-timbered facades, steep roofs, architectural details that could have come straight from Bavaria. Signs in shop windows advertised goods in both English and German. Werner heard German spoken everywhere, older women gossiping in front of the bakery, children playing in the schoolyard, men conducting business in the hardware store. The school principal, Otto Reinhardt, greeted the work detail in flawless German. He was a man in his 60s, white-haired and dignified, with the bearing of an old-world professor. Welcome, he said. We're grateful for your help. The storm took down part of our gymnasium roof, and we need it fixed before the children can use the space again. As Werner and the other prisoners worked, Otto moved among them, offering advice and sharing stories. He spoke of his grandfather, who'd founded the school in 1879, who'd believed that German children in America should learn both languages, both cultures, both histories. He used to say that being German-American made us twice as rich, Otto explained. We had access to two great traditions, two ways of thinking, two sets of stories and songs and wisdom. We didn't have to choose. We could be both. During their lunch break, Otto brought the prisoners into the school cafeteria. Local women had prepared food mix of German and American dishes. Werner found himself sitting across from a woman named Greta Schmidt, Sergeant Schmidt's sister-in-law. She spoke to him in the soft dialect of the Rhineland, asking about his family, his home, his experiences. My husband's cousin is a prisoner too, she said quietly. In Germany. He was an American soldier, captured during the Bulge offensive. We got a letter from the Red Cross saying he's alive, in a camp near Munich. I pray every day that someone is treating him with kindness, the way we try to treat you here. The simple humanity of her words broke something in Werner. He thought of the prisoners he'd seen back in Germany, the casual cruelty of the guards, the starvation rations, the systematic dehumanization. He thought of the propaganda that had taught him to see enemies instead of people. I'm sorry, he said, and the words felt inadequate. Greta reached across the table and squeezed his hand. You're not responsible for the war. None of you boys are. You're just caught up in it, same as all of us. That evening, as the truck carried them back to camp, Werner watched the Texas landscape slide past in the fading light. The endless sky was turning orange and purple, the kind of sunset that seemed to set the whole world on fire. Beside him, Ernst was quiet, lost in his own thoughts. "I want to come back here," Werner said suddenly. "After the war, if they'll let me." Ernst looked at him, surprised. "To Texas? To America? I want to see what it's like to choose who you are, instead of having it chosen for you. They'll never let us stay. We'll be sent back to Germany. Then I'll work to come back properly, apply for immigration, learn a trade. Whatever it takes." Ernst was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Maybe I'll come with you." The spring of 1944 brought news of the Allied advance in Europe. Werner listened to the reports with mixed emotions. Part of him still felt loyalty to his homeland, still winced when he heard of German defeats. But another part, the part that had grown during his months in Texas, understood that the regime's defeat was necessary. That the Germany he'd fought for had never really existed except in propaganda posters and fevered speeches. In April, a new program began at the camp. German prisoners who showed trustworthiness and good conduct were being allowed to attend educational classes. Werner signed up immediately, choosing English literature and American history. The classes were taught by a German-American professor from Austin named Dr. Heinrich Bauer, a man who'd fled the regime in 1935 and now taught at the university. "I left because I could see where it was heading," Dr. Bauer explained on the first day of class. "I loved Germany, loved her poets and philosophers, her scientists and composers. But I loved freedom more. I loved the idea that a person could think their own thoughts, read any book, debate any idea. And I knew that the regime would destroy all of that." Through Dr. Bauer's classes, Werner discovered American writers, Whitman's celebration of democracy, Twain's skepticism of authority, Thoreau's defense of individual conscience. He read about American history, about the waves of German immigration, about the ways immigrant communities had enriched American culture while maintaining their own traditions. He also learned about the German-American Bund, the pro-regime organization that had tried to spread its ideology among German Americans before the war. Dr. Bauer spoke about this with obvious pain. "They tried to claim that being German meant supporting the regime," he said. "They tried to say that German Americans had to choose between their heritage and their country. But they were wrong. Most German Americans rejected them completely, because they understood that German culture, real German culture, had nothing to do with that poisonous ideology." By summer, Werner's transformation was complete. He could speak English fluently now, though his accent would always mark him as foreign. He could navigate American social customs, understand American jokes, appreciate American music. But he also maintained his German identity, speaking the language whenever he could, reading German literature, participating in the German cultural programs the camp organized. He'd become, in essence, what he'd once thought impossible, a man with two identities, two homelands, two sets of loyalties that somehow didn't contradict each other. In August, word came that Paris had been liberated. The camp erupted in celebration, guards cheering, prisoners divided between those who mourned and those who quietly rejoiced. Werner found Sergeant Schmidt by the fence line, watching the sunset with an expression of profound relief. "It's almost over," Schmidt said in German. "The war, I mean, the real war. The fighting will go on for months yet, but the outcome is certain now." "What happens to us?" Werner asked. "After?" "You'll go home eventually. Be reunited with your families. Try to rebuild. And if I wanted to come back here? To America?" Schmidt turned to look at him, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You'd have to wait. Let some time pass. Prove yourself. But yes, it's possible. Many prisoners after the First War chose to stay or return. If you're serious about it, I can help you understand the process." "I'm serious," Schmidt nodded slowly. "Then we'll talk. When the time is right." The autumn of 1944 brought cooler temperatures and news of the advance into Germany itself. Werner listened to reports of his homeland's devastation with a grief he hadn't expected to feel. Whatever his intellectual understanding of the war's necessity, the emotional reality of Germany's defeat cut deep. But the grief was mixed with something else, a strange kind of hope. The regime that had corrupted his homeland was dying. The propaganda machine that had twisted German culture into something ugly was being destroyed. Maybe, in the ruins, real German culture could be rebuilt. The culture of Goethe and Beethoven, of philosophy and science, of the things his grandmother had taught him to value. In November, Dr. Bauer's class discussed post-war reconstruction. The professor was passionate about the topic, pacing the classroom as he spoke. Germany will need to rebuild not just her cities, but her soul, he said. She needs people who understand both German and American values, who can help bridge the gap between the two cultures. People who can show that German identity doesn't require authoritarianism, that German culture can thrive in democracy. Werner raised his hand. You think former prisoners could help with that? Men who've seen both sides? I think you're in a unique position, Dr. Bauer said carefully. You've experienced both the regime's propaganda and American reality. You've seen German culture preserved in communities here, seen how it can coexist with democratic values. That knowledge could be invaluable in rebuilding. The class ended, but Werner stayed behind. Dr. Bauer was organizing his papers, preparing for his long drive back to Austin. Professor, I need to know something, Werner said. How did you do it? Leave Germany. Build a new life here, without losing who you were? Dr. Bauer set down his briefcase and sat on the edge of his desk. I didn't lose who I was. I became more fully who I could be. In Germany, under the regime, I was being forced into a narrow definition of German identity, one based on blood and soil and obedience. Here, I could be German in all the ways that mattered to me, the language, the literature, the philosophical traditions, while also being free. Free to think, to question, to grow. It doesn't feel like a betrayal? Of what? Of the regime that would have sent me to a camp for teaching the wrong books. Of the ideology that destroyed everything I loved about German culture? Dr. Bauer shook his head. I'm more loyal to the real Germany, the Germany of Kant and Heine and Thomas Mann, than the regime ever was. And so are the German Americans you've met here. They've preserved aspects of German culture that are being destroyed back home. Werner thought about this as winter approached. The camp routine had become familiar, almost comfortable. He worked his assigned details, attended his classes, wrote letters home when the Red Cross system allowed. His mother's responses were infrequent and censored, but enough got through to let him know she was alive, still living in their damaged house in Heidelberg. In one letter, she wrote, "The city is destroyed, Werner, but the castle still stands. Somehow, through all the bombs, the old castle survives. I think of it as a sign that the things that matter, the old things, the true things can survive even this." Werner carried that letter with him for weeks, reading it until the paper grew soft from handling. His mother, whether she realized it or not, was making the same point Dr. Bauer had made. That real culture, real identity, survived through the deepest respect for what was true and lasting, not through political ideology or military conquest. By Christmas 1944, the war's end was clearly visible on the horizon. The camp held a Christmas celebration, and Werner was struck by the strange mix of traditions. American carols sung in English, German carols sung in German, decorations that blended both cultures' styles. The German-American guards moved seamlessly between languages and traditions, and Werner finally understood what they'd been trying to show him all along. Identity wasn't fixed. Culture wasn't a cage. A person could be German and American, could love both traditions, could honor both heritages. The regime had lied about Americans, about culture, about identity itself. They'd tried to create a world of rigid categories, of us versus them, of pure blood and pure soil. But here in Texas, Werner had discovered a more complex, more honest, more human truth. In January 1945, word came that the Soviets had entered Germany from the east. Werner's thoughts turned to his family, to his friends, to the city he'd loved. Whatever happened next, Germany would be changed forever. The regime would fall. The propaganda would be exposed. The terrible price of the war would have to be confronted. But Werner also thought about the future, about the possibility of returning to America, of helping to rebuild the connections between German and American cultures, of showing others what he'd learned in this unlikely place. One evening in February, Sergeant Schmidt called Werner to his office. The older man looked tired but satisfied. The war is almost over, Schmidt said without preamble. Germany's defeat is a matter of months now, maybe weeks. You'll be going home soon. And after? After, you rebuild your life, help rebuild your country. But if you're still serious about coming back here, about immigrating to America, I've prepared some documents. Schmidt pushed a folder across the desk. Information about the immigration process. Letters of recommendation from me and from the work details you've been on. Contact information for organizations that help with immigrant settlement. Werner opened the folder, seeing page after page of carefully prepared documentation. His throat tightened. Why are you helping me? Because you remind me of my father, Schmidt said simply. He came here with nothing but determination and a willingness to work. He built a good life, raised good children, contributed to his community. I think you could do the same. I won't forget this. Any of this. Good. Don't forget what you learned here either. About identity, about culture, about what it means to be human. Germany's going to need people who understand those lessons. The spring of 1945 brought Germany's surrender. The camp gathered around radios to hear the news, and Werner felt a strange mixture of relief and grief. The war was over. The killing would stop. But his homeland had been utterly defeated, divided, occupied. Whatever came next would be different from everything he'd known. In the weeks following the surrender, the prisoners began the slow process of repatriation. Groups left weekly, shipped to ports, and then across the Atlantic to a Germany many of them barely recognized from photographs. Cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, millions dead or displaced. Ernst left in June, returning to Hamburg to search for his father. Before he left, he and Werner shared a final conversation by the camp fence. If I find him, Ernst said, if my father's still alive, I'll tell him about this place. About what we learned here. I think he'd want to know that German culture survived somewhere, even if it was across an ocean. Write to me if you can, Werner said. Let me know what you find. They shook hands, and Ernst climbed onto the truck that would take him to the processing center. Werner watched until the vehicle disappeared into the distance, feeling the loss like a physical ache. Werner's turn came in July. He was processed out of the camp, given travel documents and a small amount of money, and sent on the long journey back to Germany. As the ship crossed the Atlantic, he stood at the rail and watched the American coast disappear. He'd arrived as a prisoner, convinced of his own righteousness and his enemy's evil. He was leaving as something different, a man who'd learned that identity was more complex than propaganda claimed, that culture could bridge divides, that humanity was bigger than any ideology. He returned to find Heidelberg damaged but recognizable. His mother had survived, living in their partially destroyed house, eking out an existence in the ruins. His father had died in the final months of the war, killed in a bombing raid while working in a factory. His sister had married and moved to Frankfurt, trying to build a life in the rubble. Werner threw himself into reconstruction work, using the carpentry skills he'd honed in Texas to help rebuild homes and businesses. He also sought out anyone who spoke English, anyone who could help him maintain the language skills he'd developed. He wrote letters to Sergeant Schmidt, to Dr. Bauer, to the Wagner family, keeping the connections alive. It took 5 years. 5 years of paperwork and interviews and waiting, of proving his rehabilitation and his skills and his intentions. But in 1950, Werner Muller boarded a ship in Bremen and sailed to New York. From there, he took a train to Texas, to San Antonio, where Sergeant Schmidt met him at the station. Welcome back, Schmidt said in German, gripping Werner's hand. Welcome home. Werner settled in New Braunfels, the German town he'd briefly visited during his imprisonment. He found work as a carpenter, joined the German-American community, and slowly built a life. He never forgot his German identity, spoke the language at home, maintained German traditions, taught his children about their heritage. But he was also deeply, proudly American. Years later, when people asked him about his experiences in the war, about his time as a prisoner, Werner would tell them about the moment that changed everything. Not the moment of capture, not the moment of defeat, but the moment an American guard spoke to him in perfect German and shattered every assumption he'd been taught to believe. That's when I learned, he would say, that identity isn't about choosing between two things. It's about finding ways to honor both. It's about understanding that culture and humanity are bigger than any border, any government, any ideology. The regime tried to make us believe in walls between people, between cultures, between identities. But what I found in Texas was bridges. And bridges are so much stronger. The sun still blazes over Texas, still beats down on endless horizons and endless sky. The camp where Werner spent his imprisonment is gone now, returned to farmland, marked only by a small historical plaque that few people notice. But the lessons learned there, the transformations that happened there, echo through generations. In German-American communities across the state, people still speak both languages, still honor both traditions, still prove that identity can be complex and layered and rich. They're the living answer to the regime's rigid ideology, the proof that culture survives through respect and preservation, not through conquest and forced conformity. And somewhere in that tradition, in the stories passed down through families, in the dual language conversations and the mixed traditions, Werner Muller's journey continues. A journey from certainty to doubt, from propaganda to truth, from prisoner to immigrant, from confusion to understanding. A journey that proved the most powerful resistance to authoritarianism isn't violence or warfare, but the simple human act of recognizing the complexity and dignity in others, of learning their language, hearing their stories, seeing them not as enemies, but as people. Texas, 1943 to 1945, where the horizon swallowed fear, and where German prisoners discovered that identity wasn't the cage they'd been taught it was, but a door to understanding, to growth, to becoming more fully human. The guards who spoke German, the families who shared their tables, the communities that preserved their heritage, while building something new they didn't defeat their prisoners through cruelty or force. They defeated them through something far more powerful, the demonstration that another way was possible, that culture and freedom weren't enemies but partners, that the human capacity for multiple loyalties and complex identities was a strength, not a weakness. And in the end, that lesson proved more transformative than any battlefield victory, more lasting than any political ideology, more true than any propaganda. Because it spoke to something fundamental about human nature, our capacity to grow, to change, to transcend the narrow identities others try to impose on us, and to build lives that honor multiple traditions without betraying any of them. The story of German POWs in Texas isn't just about the war, or about imprisonment, or even about German-American relations. It's about the essential human question of who we are and who we can become. And the answer Texas offered, that we can be more than one thing, can honor multiple heritages, can grow beyond the narrow definitions others create for us, remains as relevant now as it was then. In the voices of German-American guards speaking their ancestral language to confused prisoners, in the patient explanations of farmers and teachers and ordinary people trying to bridge cultural divides, in the quiet transformations of young men who arrived as enemies and left as friends, in all of this, a deeper truth emerged. That identity is not fixed but fluid, not singular but multiple, not a cage but a door. And that the human capacity for understanding, for growth, for transcending the narrow categories that divide us, is perhaps our greatest strength as a species. Werner Muller's journey from German prisoner to American immigrant is one man's story. But it's also the story of thousands like him, of the complex dance between heritage and new identity, of the ways war can sometimes unexpectedly, unintentionally create opportunities for transformation and growth.